I will say what an honor it is to be here today. I'm just absolutely flattered. As learning designers, you're the people that I go to when I can't figure something out or when I have an idea. You are the cutting edge, the people who are going to lead us to our future here at Penn State. I have no doubt about that. So thank you so much for having me here today. Another quick introduction. My husband, Chaz Wall, is back there. Yes, he really does exist. Some of you know me, but have never met him. He's a computer programmer and finds it absolutely entertaining that his wife, the music professor, talks about technology. So he's just here to haggle me. Hopefully not too much. But just like many of the students of today, I come to technology because I need it. Let me get this going. Whoops. All right. So, after nearly 200 years of educational reform, I have a big question.
Are we there yet? No. 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 Are we there yet? Are we there yet? You're real.
I love that clip. So, of course, the answer is no, we are not there. Yet the bigger question is, have we been driving in the right direction the whole time? And I'm not sure that we have. So what is it going to take to get us there? And I'd like to start today with just a brief story. Two married professors from snowy Minnesota decided to take a winter vacation back at the same simple Florida hotel they had honeymooned in 25 years earlier. But because of the wife's complicated work schedule, the husband departed first, and when he got there, he received a message that she would be meeting him soon. He decided to send her an email to announce his arrival. However, due to a single mistyped letter in the email address, it went instead to an elderly woman in Oklahoma whose minister husband had just died. This is what she read. Dearest, well, the journey is over and I have finally arrived. I was surprised to find they have email here now. They tell me you'll be joining me soon. It'll be good to be together again. Love always. P.S. Be prepared. It's hot down here. We live and we work in a time when a single misdigit on a keyboard can send our life spiraling into chaos for hours, for days, for even longer. Unfortunately, at the same time, our reality is just like that of the departed minister. Here we are, circling the sun on an 8,000-mile rock for an incredibly short amount of time. It's certainly long enough to create problems, but not always long enough to solve them. And far too often, not long enough to solve all the problems that have been handed down to us from previous generations. These are some of the biggest issues facing humanity. These were collected by the European Union in survey. Nuclear weapons, armed conflict, infectious disease, global population issues, energy, terrorism, economics, climate. We're still dealing with a lack of clean drinking water in a lot of the world. Inequality. But perhaps the scariest issue facing humanity is that we just don't know yet. We don't know what problems our children will face in the future. Talk about scary. What skills and what tools do they need to solve the known and the unknown? What can we give them to best prepare for their future? And while every civilization in history has been built around the utilization of tools, techniques, and systems to solve our problems and make living easier, digital technology has provided a massive leap in human capabilities to communicate, to share, to create, and to mitigate complexities. So for children born after 1990, they've never known a world without the internet and digital technologies. And the magnitude of information that's surrounding this generation is absolutely staggering. Currently, there's more than 600,000 iPhone apps, 1 trillion web pages, 8 years worth of YouTube videos being uploaded daily, over 4 million Wikipedia articles in English alone. More than 2 billion people are connected online, reaching 5 billion in 2020. World of Warcraft, massively multiplayer online game, created an entire civilization equaling 5.93 million years of experience in its first 10 years of gameplay. That's equal to the entire history of humans on this planet. One thing is for certain. If we teach today the way that we taught yesterday, then we rob our children of tomorrow. Now, one would think simply our presence in the digital age would equate to an increased ability to solve our problems, but that's not so. As Richardson notes, access doesn't automatically come with an ability to use the web well. We aren't suddenly self-directed, organized, and literate enough to make sense of all the people and information online, or savvy enough to connect and build relationships with others in safe, ethical, and effective ways. No matter how often we dub our children digital natives, the fact is they need to be taught how to thrive in the abundance of our time. James G. states, for humans, learning is like food. It's a deep pleasure. The paradox is, how does school so frequently kill that instinct? In terms of evolution, if you had no capacity to learn, you wouldn't be with us anymore, because learning at its best, it's a joy and it's a pleasure. It's really only in schools that people can find it a pain. And I believe if we want to move the human race from drudgery to enlightened empowerment, we need to move schools from a must learn, or at worst must simply attend, to a want to learn, or at best a love for learning. And to do this, we need to seriously explore and examine the ways in which teaching and learning occur by choice, such as online or in games. So what's the role of schooling in the digital age and beyond? And in order to begin answering this question, we need to look at the history of education in this country. Now, I am concrete sequential. I like to know where we're going. Anybody like me in the audience? Yeah. I had a hard time doing with this. The history of education in 45 minutes or less. So I don't have a roadmap for you. I thought we'd do a tasting instead. So here's your tapas menu. If you're like me and you'd like to know what we're going to talk about. Past affects the future, why schools are slow to change, the historical purpose of education in America, historical tools and technologies. One slide, educational reform, in 2 minutes or less. Modern learning and today's students, and then a couple of ideas for catching up. So let's begin with a small step back in time. In 1963, Clark Kerr, the president of University of California, lectured at Harvard University about the unending consistency of higher education. He noted that historically, about 85 institutions in the Western world, established in 1520, still exist in recognizable form. And this includes the Catholic Church, the parliaments of Iceland and the Isle of Man, a few Swiss cantons, and 70 universities. According to Kerr, everything else changes, but the university mostly endures. Also in 1963, the company Tandy Radio Shack was formed and began selling electronic products mainly to hobbyists. 15 years later, Tandy Radio Shack introduced the TRS-80 Model 1 computer, which was one of the foremost major steps in introducing home computing to the American public. Like the Commodore PET and the Apple II, which were introduced within months of the TRS-80, the computer came assembled and ready to run. To his credit, in 1963, Clark Kerr had no idea that advancements in technology that began the same year would lead to what some are calling the collapse of higher education. Today, many believe the university community is rapidly approaching a tipping point after which teaching and learning will never be the same. Some believe that those universities who embrace new technologies will thrive and excel, and those who do not see this change coming will fade away. Business management guru Peter Drucker predicted in 1997, 30 years from now, the big university campuses will be relics. Universities won't survive. Sebastian Thrun, co-founder of Udacity, took it a big step further, stating that in 50 years, there'll only be 10 institutions in the world delivering higher education. Now, Thrun and Udacity have made a pretty big tail turn here and limited their grand prediction regarding the impact of MOOCs. But this retreat in direction simply adds to the uncertainty of the impact of learning online and of traditional schooling. It's unknown the degree to which universities will be affected, but one thing is for certain. We are at a time of renewal, and those institutions that are agile and adaptive through this renaissance will fare better than those who aren't. Online learning isn't the next big thing, it's the now big thing, said in 1999. And as former U.S. Education Secretary Rod Page suggests, we need to question why education appears to be the only business still debating the usefulness of technology. So why is education so slow to move? Look, universities are beating K-12 by an antenna. Yeah. Well, schools are institutions. And institutions are simultaneously one of humankind's greatest and worst inventions. The intention of an institution is to manage a group of people around a common goal. And as G explains, they are intended to think for us by taking the difficult decision-making, planning, reflecting, problem-solving, and freezing them into procedures and solutions known as policies that we don't need to think about very often. As a result, institutions are, to a great extent, frozen thought. The problem is, once a solution is frozen, it takes a tremendous amount of work to unfreeze it, have it reconsidered by others, and then refreeze or institutionalize a different or new decision. Institutions are also prescriptive. Schools prescribe the learning processes that can take place within them. They establish meeting times, class schedules, class locations, and even the exact time and date of which students should be able to prove their mastery of a subject, a final exam. Institutions purposefully limit the ability to customize learning, and optimization by students is nearly always viewed as an attempt at cheating the system. The prescriptiveness of institutions limit what teachers can and cannot do to meet the individual needs of their students, often disregarding educators' main objective, which is to empower people. One of the most harmful aspects of this prescribed process is the treatment of failure as a punitive and often permanent measure. Failure actually is, at its core, the key to all progress, innovation, and learning, rather than something that should lead to permanent negative consequences. I love failure. I talk about it a lot. I'll come back and share more of my ideas on failure in a bit. Institutions are also closed environments. They're intended to divide people, particularly into those who are members and those who are not. Schools have a history of bringing learning to people when what we really need to do is, they have a history of bringing people to learning when what we really need to do is bring learning to people. Today, there are over 4,600 degree-granting post-secondary colleges in the U.S. They bring in $490 billion in revenue each year, employ more than 3.5 million people, and hold $990 billion in assets, including cash, investments, lands, building. These many cities of teaching and learning are big business, and there is tremendous cost associated with attending them. To many, higher education is simply not accessible. College debt in the United States is over $1 trillion, and the cost of going to school is shamefully getting in the way of people's lifelong independence and the fulfillment of their dreams. But globally, Americans are still the lucky ones. Access to higher ed is possible for some of us. For most of the world, it simply is not. And access to education at all levels should be a basic human right. So, the institutional nature of schools based on prescriptive and closed environments are only the tip of the iceberg when we consider the philosophical foundations of learning in this country. So let's take a step further back in time. And in order to understand the purpose of schooling in America, we need to understand why and what principles formal education began in this country. So until about 1840, American schools remained largely private and unorganized. According to the 1840 census, 55% of children ages 6 to 15 attended primary school. But big changes began to occur in 1840. Let me introduce you to Frederick II, King of Prussia, and his colleague here, Fichte, who was a philosopher. The King of Prussia, and Prussia was an empire that eventually became Germany at the end of World War I, began a public model of education. But the purpose of that educational model was to instill loyalty to the crown and to train young men for the military and bureaucracy. Our philosopher here said, if you want to influence the student at all, you must do more than merely talk to him. You must fashion him, and fashion him in such a way that he cannot will otherwise than what you will wish him to will. So this is what education was about. It was about teaching people what to think, not teaching people how to think or how to develop their own thoughts. I think this cartoon expresses it all. Scary that that's modern day, isn't it? Yeah? Anybody feel like that before? Well, here comes Horace Mann, an American statesman. He visited Prussia in 1843 and returned home to lobby for public schools in America. And while he had some really wonderful and revolutionary ideas about education in this country, he also had a lot in common with the Prussians and found school to really be about obedience. Here he says, by instilling values such as obedience to authority, promptness in attendance, and organizing the time according to bell ringing, will help students prepare for their future employment. Isn't that interesting? Well, this is 1840. So what future employment is he referring to? Well, for girls and women, it was factory work, and here we've got some young girls folding boxes in a cardboard factory, and underneath them we've got women working in a textile. I think they're doing thread or yarn here. For boys and men, also in the factories, there's some young boys rolling cigars, and in the bottom, a power plant. Isn't that amazing? Men working in the power plant. So formal American education was, at its birth, all about management and about the workforce. And today's schools are still built on the concept of management. There are school board administrators and school administrators, and this concept of management trickles down to the classroom, where teachers are often the managers of their own students' learning and engagement. Something crucial that we fail to recognize, but Daniel Pink shared with us several years ago, is that management is simply a technology, and it's an old technology at that. It developed fully in the 1850s, when at the peak of the Industrial Revolution, it served society well, with helping those with lower educational capital benefit from the leadership of others with more educational expertise who could lead them in the factories and in the fields. The problem with management is that it's all about compliance and control, which up until the end of the 20th century worked, but has utterly fallen apart in the digital age. Digital society requires engagement, not compliance, and the technology of engagement is not management, it's self-direction. Now, we've all been influenced by the technology of management in schooling, and I'm just curious, what has been the influence of other technologies, educational technologies, on our thinking and on our intellect? I read quite a lot in the field of intellect. I find it fascinating how we define and assess intelligence over time. Pardon me. Is it biological or something else? Are some people born smarter than others? Well, one of the most interesting discoveries in recent years is that the environment actually triggers genetic expression. Meaning you can be predisposed genetically to have a certain grouping of traits that may come together to help you achieve or have strengths in a particular area, but that they may not be realized based on environmental factors. There's been 28 studies, to my count, from genetics, neuroscience, cognitive psychology, and developmental psychology that demonstrate that the nature versus nurture debate is misleading. We are neither born nor made. The environment is inseparable from our genes. So how we learned in school, including the tools that influence that learning, say a lot about who you are and how you think. How many of you have used a paper card catalog? Quite a few. How many have never really used a paper card catalog? Oh, we're an older group. This is interesting. Yeah. Well, think about that. How does such a device shape your brain, the organizational system, the way that you think? How would you differ from someone who hasn't had that experience? So I want to take a pop quiz. And I want you to think which of the following educational technologies were in use during your own schooling. And then in your heads, take it a step further and think, how might this have shaped the way I think? So let's begin. Clay tablets. Anyone? Clay tablets? No. Okay, we'll move forward. School slates. 1890. Anyone use a slate in school? They're afraid to raise their hands. Personalized learning, right? Yeah. Chalkboard. This came around 1890, still going strong today. One of the biggest innovations in educational technology. Yeah? Hands? Thank you. Group learning. Wonderful tool. Pencil. 1900s. How many of you, anyone here writing notes with a pencil right now? Look around. One person. Interesting. You go, girl. Retro. A mechanical pencil. Yeah. I think this is another personalized learning tool, and this was great. It replaced the quill, much easier to write. But I want you to think for a moment, for many of us, when was the last time you held a pencil? How often do you use one in daily life now compared to childhood? How much of what you did then you now do on your phone? How much longer until the pencil is a rarity? Cursive writing, it's in the same position, right? Do we need it? I don't know. Stereoscope, 3D, virtual reality, 1905. At the turn of the century, the Keystone Viewing Company began to market these basic tools. They had created also about 100 images to illustrate points being made in lectures. Amazing. Anyone used one of these before? A couple folks have used them, yeah. Film projector, 1925, similar to the motion picture projector. You know, Thomas Edison had a prediction about these, which is quite interesting. He said, books will soon be obsolete in schools. Scholars will soon be instructed through the eye. Film projectors? Anyone get the opportunity to be the person that changes the film out? That was like a special role in class? Yeah, I remember. Radio, 1925, New York City's Board of Education was actually the first organization to send lessons to schools through radio stations. Over the next decade, schooling of the air began broadcasting programs to millions of Americans, information beginning to flow beyond geographic barriers. Mimeograph machine, 1940. Raise your hand if you know what this is. I'm in there too. Surviving until the Xerox age, the mimeograph made copies by hand crank, and then it became electrified, right? Does that make you a little less grumpy about your current photocopier? So if you're in my generation, you also remember that interesting mimeograph smell. Some people liked it, some people hated it. You might also remember teachers coming to class late and frustrated with blue hands, yeah? Or seeing a shadow of whatever was left in the mimeograph run before you got to class, and it's in the shadow of every worksheet you got, yeah. You probably also remember feeling relieved to get a, quote, ditto copy, because that meant that you didn't have to write down the entire assignment out of a book that you share with your desk partner. Wow, that's in our learning process for those of you who experienced it. 1950s, the slide rule. It's a mechanical, analog, personal computer. It's used primarily for multiplication, division, functions such as root, logarithms, trigonometry. Anyone? Slide rule? Yeah, okay. Here comes television, 1957, and by the 60s, there were 50 channels, and some of which were educational in nature. Then we start getting a little weird. 1957, B.F. Skinner, a scientist and behavioralist, developed a series of devices that would allow students to proceed through material at their own pace. And it was a regulated program of instruction. It would provide a question, a missing word, an equation, and then students would write their answer on a piece of paper, turn a series of cranks, and they would immediately see if they were right or wrong. So this is what this looks like. I'll just show you a quick sample here.
Each student is using a teaching machine, a device which creates vastly improved conditions for effective study. What are teaching machines? How are they used? What can they teach? Who prepares the material they teach? And how does this material differ from textbooks?
Fascinating, isn't it? That guy's cranking through. I'm doing it. Anyone use one of these? Okay, I have yet to meet someone who has. But here we are, really trying to push independent learning, but in a very behavioralist way. 1970, handheld calculator. This was huge, but there were two main issues. Teachers were slow to adopt them because they feared they would undermine the learning of basic skills. Do you remember that argument? Huge argument. Secondly, no normal people could afford them, especially children. Parents didn't buy this for kids. It was, at least in my household, it's too expensive. 1972, what is this? Scantron. Did you know the machines were actually free to schools? It was the papers they had to pay for, and they were pricey. Yeah, it was the actual cards they paid for. How this machine has influenced schools, it's absolutely amazing. It assessed an entire generation with multiple choice questions. The problem with multiple choice questions is that they're based on knowledge help me with that word. Knowledge acquisition, thank you, and not on critical or creative thinking. For example, a Scantron test only allows for questions like this. Which geographic feature impacted the development of the Gupta Empire? A, island location, B, volcanoes, C, monsoons, D, permafrost. First of all, I can't imagine why you would need to know this information other than for a test. I mean, who cares? But what's the more meaningful question about this topic area if it were even worth asking? Perhaps, in what ways have the inventions of the Gupta Empire had an influence on modern culture? And that's a bit different than selecting it from a list of choices, right? This has shaped the way people are thinking. Now, what's really crazy about this multiple choice question that I just shared with you is that it's actually a question asked on the 2011 New York State Regents Global History Test, which is required for graduation. The after effects of this machine are still present in American education. 1977, Apple II series, quickly followed by the Plato computer in 1980. Public schools averaged about one computer for every 92 students in 1984. And the Plato was one of the most used early computers to gain a foothold in the educational market. How many of you use this? Plato or an Apple II? I spent all semester programming in BASIC to make a smile appear. Yeah. In 1985, CD-ROM, a single CD could store an entire encyclopedia plus audio and video. This paved the way for CDRW and flash drives, equating to easy personal storage. I think this is pretty incredible. This says to us that what we create as individuals is important enough to save. 1999, chalkboard gets a facelift. How many of you didn't know it's that early? 1999, slow to adopt, right? 2005, the iClicker was the first device to allow teachers to quickly poll students and get the results in real time. So relationships with the teacher and information are changing. 2006, based on the idea of one laptop per child, here comes the EXO laptop. Affordable, can move around the world, can be donated to developing countries, and our iPad, and here we are in the educational app-filled present, right? Different tools in education shape the way that we think. Now, educational technology and tools have been with us from the very beginning, but they've become more important in the digital age because they have a greater ability to impact how we engage with the world around us and how we learn. Digital technologies not only change what we learn, the core knowledge base, but the skills of learning itself. As society, technology, and politics change, education reforms. But unfortunately, the first narrative around modern reform is being written by businessmen and policymakers who see schools as places where technology is increasingly a tool to better deliver content and where a growing emphasis on passing the test becomes a business proposition. one tied to competing against other countries, schools, classrooms, teachers, and between students. In this view, we focus on the easiest part of learning, interactive information acquisition, basic skills, and a little bit of critical thinking. All things that can be easily identified and scored. Learning is regulated to the quantifiable, which makes it easy to rank and compare. So how does the class of 2015 learn? Well, it depends on if you mean in school or in real life. So let's take a moment at learning outside of school. This is the learning through digital information. I've termed this the hacking of shared open sources. I believe that by coming to an understanding of how learning happens in these digital spaces, we can better understand the path that schooling must consider in order to remain pertinent or become pertinent, perhaps. The term hacking may appear controversial, but if we disregard the media hype, as software developers and the make community would wish us to do, I believe it's the perfect analogy to describe successful modern learning. Hacking is a word that was developed by pioneers in the computer industry to explain modifications that add functionality to a device that was not originally intended. In essence, hacking is a playful or clever approach to a self-described goal. Educational hackers, which I will use the term, Kyle Peck's term, nomads, take an organic approach to learning. They hunt and gather content to reuse, repurpose, and thanks to the readable, writable web, create sources for others to contribute to and use. Key to this hacking approach to learning is social collaboration, and the base materials for the learning is anything that nomads can get their hands on. The term open source originated in computer programming, where programmers grew frustrated with the expense and limitations of company-owned proprietary software. The aim of the open source movement is to give computer users freedom and control. This is done through collaboratively developing and providing software that is based on the following 4 freedom rights. Users are free to run the software, share it, study it, and modify it. Open learning follows the same model. It's a combination of open educational resources, formal curricular content, social media, games, and materials not necessarily intended for educational purposes, such as the entire World Wide Web. Now, individuals who possess like interests gather in what are called affinity spaces, where people can share knowledge, discuss problems, and create and offer solutions. There's great power in these affinity spaces. Nomads, I love it, can organize themselves into large knowledge-sharing communities to produce real products, real knowledge, design and solve real-world problems. They can create amateur organizations that compete with professional organizations for legitimacy and ease of use. This is the power that built Wikipedia and has threatened encyclopedias forever, right? So how do we make the leap? How can schooling catch up with the rest of the world? If I could sum up the biggest issue facing education, I have to say that delivering old content through new tools is not going to solve the world's problems. We need to create a new paradigm. And I agree with Will Richardson when he says it's not about delivery, it's about discovery. In a new paradigm, we need to seek and take full advantage of technology not only as a tool, but as a way of life. And the heart of a truly digital education emerges when we focus on critical and creative thinking skills, which will develop the habits and the dispositions that are needed to leap to deep, lifelong learning. We must swing from content mastery to learning mastery, where how we learn takes precedent over what we learn because the content is easily available. A popular quote paraphrased from psychologist Herbert Gurdjieff predicts that the illiterate of the 21st century will not be those who cannot read or write. It will be those who cannot learn, unlearn, and relearn. And so I'd like to spend my remaining time with you here talking about a few ideas I have for catching up. These are the concepts of failure, engagement, flexibility, and transformation. This is definitely failure here in every way, shape, and form. Sorry, I just find that so amazing. The gangsta way of storing them files. All right, floppies. I love words, so let's talk a little bit about words. We live in an age that is obsessed with success. Is this really what the goal of school should be? Success can be defined as the accomplishment of an aim or purpose. If you're successful at doing these things, knowing these things, you become a successful person. That's the path, we're told, right? Sounds great. We want our students to be successful. It's the desired end goal of education, right? For them to leave us and have successful lives professionally, personally. And what's the opposite of success? Failure, defeat, and worst of all, sadness, unhappiness, unfulfillment. How utterly depressing. So what's failure? The definition of failure is lack of success. Well, that's easy. That makes things really easy and clear-cut until we get to the second definition, the omission of expected or required action. Action's an interesting word because it implies process. If failure is the antonym of success, then what's the antonym of failure? Success is there, but it's further down the line. Before it come words like betterment, improvement, increase, rise. All of these words are process words. They're about advancement and not simply the concept of success, which is an end result. The process words implies that through failure, you can work your way towards empowerment. Isn't that what schools should be about? There could be several answers to this question, but I think the most interesting words that I see here are, shouldn't school be about betterment, courage, continuation? Game player who's about to fail. I'd like to take just a moment here and say that one of the most comprehensive models for learning that we have is video games, and this is where my history has been, so I always kind of see things through that lens. This is the image of a game player who's about to fail. You saw this when Jane McGonigal was here. Remember that presentation? She did a wonderful job. You can see his eyes are wide open. He's taking in a big breath, and you can imagine his heart is pounding. He is not going to make it. Although a gamer spends 80% of their time failing, they don't give up. They stick with the difficult challenge, and they use the feedback they get from the game to get better. Video game designers realize that in order to motivate people, they need to purposefully lower the cost of failure. They understand that if a price of failure is too high, you won't explore, you won't take risks, you won't try new things, you get uptight, you think in very narrow ways, so they lower that cost of failure. In many games, you die, but you go back to your most recent save, so there's a price, but it's low enough that it says to you, why don't you take some risks? Why don't you explore everything? Why don't you rethink your goal? Why don't you try a new style? This is pretty much the exact opposite of failure in school, where failure most often is punitive and permanent. There's nothing motivational about those kinds of failure. Anybody know the game? Monkey Ball 2, you're very close. Good job. Let's game later, okay? Engagement. I totally understood the replicator. Thank you. Motivation. Part of our problem in schools is the concept of rewards and punishments. The idea that when you reward good behavior, you'll get more of it. And when you punish bad behavior, you'll get less of it. These are these if-then statements. It's the core of most public policy, and as a result is at the heart of most schools. But studies in motivation have shown us just the opposite. Rewards work when they're associated with a simple task, such as stand on a leg for 10 minutes, get $10. But when the task is more complex and long-term, they do the opposite. Rewards cause us to overanalyze, make errors, and underperform. Engagement, let me get these going. Engagement is much more related to control and interest. The more control and agency a person has in their learning situation, the greater their desire to contribute, and the desired solutions and exhibit signs, and to desire solutions and exhibit signs of mastery. So here we've got 3 samples from K-12. These are all 5th grade. We've got a math lesson happening up there. Look, he's got his hands folded. We've got a general music lesson here and 5th grade band. Think about control. Who is in control in these situations? Where does control lie? What about the engagement? How are students demonstrating their engagement? How is mastery being shown? Let's go to a different learning environment. Where is control? Who has control in this? Pac-Man, of course. Player, right? What is engagement? It's active, it's alive, it's happening, it's a result of their involvement. Mastery, constant feedback. Different way to think about teaching and learning. Why is schooling much more like a bunch of game manuals than the games themselves? It's a question I have. Flexibility. I thought we needed a little humor break at this point. At one point, students could graduate with a business degree, say in accounting, and this would qualify them for a lifetime of work in a particular area. But for graduates today, this simply isn't the case. Between the economic downturn, flood of college-educated resources employers can choose from, the general lack of company and employee loyalties, and the ever-changing needs of big business, it's the companies that seek stability that are at the greatest risk for ruin. Rita McGrath, a professor at Columbia School of Business, states, "Stability, not change, is the state that's most dangerous in highly dynamic competitive environments." In 2012, 1,700 worldwide CEOs were asked what they look for in new hires. The four most desirable traits were communication, collaboration, flexibility, creativity. Gone from this list were the actual skills that we spend an incredible amount of time studying in schools: math, science, literature. There's an old motto in business, and it's hire traits, train skills. But in today's dynamic environment, it might be more prudent to hire traits that enable ongoing renewal of skills. So when the average usability of an undergraduate computer science degree is less than 5 years post-graduation, what do we need to be preparing students to be able to do, and what will their future look like? McGrath believes that the future of business will be more like the opening ceremonies of the Olympics than that traditional long-term work environment of the industrial age. Instead of going to work for one company for a long period of time, it's becoming more likely that their positions will be temporary and that they'll be asked to bring their unique skill set to a specific project, work as part of a team, and then, at the conclusion of the project, go their separate ways. The cycle will then repeat throughout their careers as they move from one project to the next. It's the ability to learn and to relearn as needed. We have to stop thinking of an education as something that is delivered to us, and instead see it as something that we create for ourselves. And that's Richardson. Transformation. Schools should be about transforming students and their thinking. And transformation is such a tricky word. It's not this ethereal, artistic practice. And it's not just skipping stones across learning. It's putting on that full scuba suit and diving into learning with everything that you are. Transformation starts with making schools meaningful. If we want learning to happen, we need to give children real-world problems to solve. Give them problems where the solutions really matter and are not simply exercises in the mundane. Paul Torrance, an American psychologist, he completed the impossible, a 40-year longitudinal study that followed children into adulthood. He kept track of these people for 40 years. Beginning back in 1959, he began to study what makes people successful. In the financial world, it's the billionaires. In the workplace, it's those people who are the rate busters or the workaholics. In the sciences, it's those who rise to the top to solve big, difficult problems. He has a title for these people. He calls them beyonders because they work and they produce and achieve beyond what's typical. Following an entire high school and an entire elementary school's worth of students, he checked in at them 2 years after the start of the study, 12 years after the study, 22, 30 years, and 40 years after the start of the study. And from this data, he was able to create a checklist of criteria for those who achieve. Here's the list. They delight in deep thinking. They have tolerance of their mistakes. They love their work. They have a clear purpose. They enjoy what they do. They feel comfortable being a minority of one. They enjoy being different. They're not necessarily well-rounded. They have a sense of mission, and they have the courage to be creative. This criteria that he developed has been found to be a more meaningful and accurate indicators of success than even intelligence. So why isn't education all about building these skills, providing truly transformative experiences to bring all of these characteristics to all students? Proprietary learning owned by institutions is in very real jeopardy. And just as the open source movement disrupted software companies who hoarded their code, institutions who continue to hoard their resources are at risk of rebellion, or worse, total disregard by learners. The forces of change encroaching on today's universities, they're a summons to action. Higher education must face this new reality headlong, and you are at the front of that battle. You must be proactive and aggressive and progressive. If the tech-savvy millennials who fill our classrooms don't see the value in what we provide or how we provide it, no matter how sacred we believe our institutions to be, those entities with the potential to meet their needs will draw them further away from us. If we want to motivate students through flexibility, engagement, transformation, and the reduction of punitive failure, and we want to allow for optimization, customization, and collaboration that this born digital generation are accustomed to receiving, we need to approach teaching with an Affinity Spaces mentality by contributing our knowledge openly and collaboratively. We need to unfreeze institutional ownership and break down unnecessary barriers to entry. Does it have to be a choice between new technology and sound pedagogy? The answer, of course, is no. But we need to anticipate change and reinvent ourselves while preserving good pedagogical practices and making room for what we do not know. This means exploring digital learning practices and then developing smart approaches that rebuild, not build anew, our schooling practices in ways that are more suitable for the emerging world. Thank you so much.